Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Tejano Virtual Events. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to have some awesome information for you to share with you today. In today's session, we'll be learning about memory tricks presented by Miss Carrie Van Hoot. Before I hand it over to our presenter, I would like to mention that this session will be recorded. So if you want to come back to it later or spread it around, tell your friends about it, it'll be up on YouTube. Also, this event we will provide Tejano passport points. We will post the code on the chat towards the end of the session. If you have any questions regarding Tejano passport points, please let us know at the end, and we'll be happy to help you with any questions you may have. So now at this time, please mute your mics for the best sound experience. Otherwise, the feedback could interfere with the information we're about to share. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Miss Carrie. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can see me. Okay. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started here. Yeah, awesome. There we go. All right. So I like to do this workshop because I teach psychology here at EPCC, and this is one of my favorite topics is cognitive psychology. So we're not going to get too far into it, but I have to tell you a little bit of background. So cognitive psychology is studying the human mind. So not the brain, but like the mind, like how we think about things, how language develops, how long our attention span is, how we make decisions, stuff like that. But today, what we're going to focus on is going to be memory, the science behind memory. So before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of myth busting. So we have a saying in psychology that really needs updated now, but is that our memory is not like a tape recorder. So what that means is we can't play things back exactly how it happened, right? So if you rent a movie, or buy a movie, every single time you put the DVD in the DVD player and press play, the same thing happens. Our memories aren't like that. And like we know that, but I think we sometimes forget that as well too. So something that's kind of cool about how memory works is every single time we bring a memory to our conscious awareness, we're reconstructing that memory. So if you've ever seen the movie, I think it's called Inside Out, where there's like the little balls that are the memories and you put them in and you play them and it's like the same memory each time. It's not like that. Every time you think about something, it's a little bit different each time because we're not just pulling out like the perfect little ball of memory that's been saved in our brain. We're rebuilding it. We're reconstructing that memory each time. So it's kind of cool. So every time you think of something, you're changing it a little bit. You're either adding some details in or forgetting some details, things like that. And this is also probably the reason why if you and your friend are ever telling a story or you're talking about some event that happened and they're like, it didn't work out like that. And you're like, yes, it did. And you're both extremely sure that you're right. That's the reason why, because that's how memory works. It's naturally unreliable. So let's get into it. So there are different types of memory. If we were looking at how we would actually define a memory, it would just be like learning that persists over time. So if you remember something, it means the information was downloaded into your head, it was stored, and then later on you can retrieve the information and use it essentially. And so psychologists, when they're studying it in the lab, there's different types of memory that they would look at. So for example, recognition memory is when you recognize something, like you see something and you know it's familiar, you know you've seen it before. So this happens to me all the time, right? I'm walking around campus and I recognize a student's face. Like I know I've seen them before, but I'm like, I don't know who you are, but I recognize you. I know you kind of thing. And then there's also recall memory, which is recalling or pulling information out of your head. So this would be looking at somebody and remembering their name, right? Or taking an exam and remembering the information that I studied. And so what do you guys think? I want you to put in the chat. What do you think is harder, the recognition memory or the recall memory? So recall memory is harder, and it's because you're pulling information out of your head from scratch. I have to look and see. I wasn't gonna do it, but I'm like, recall. Yeah, you guys got it. Yeah, mine either. Yeah, but recall memory is harder, right? Because you're pulling that information out from scratch. Humans actually have great recognition memory. Like, even in late adulthood, when our memory starts to fail a little bit, our recognition memory is still really good. Recall memory, that's another thing. Um, so for example, on an exam, um, like a multiple choice question, would that be recognition memory or recall memory? If we had a multiple choice question on an exam. And what about like a short answer question? Hmm. Wait, hold on. Multiple choice. They list the answers for you, right? Like A, B, C. You don't have to remember. You don't have to read. Yes, and we were. So the multiple choice would be recognition, right? Because they list the answers, and you don't have to actually pull that information out of your head. You look at the paper and you recognize it, and you're like, "Oh, that's what it is." With an essay question, that would be recall because you start off with a blank slate and you have to pull everything out of your brain. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And this is actually a mistake that students make a lot when you're studying, right? Because sometimes the instructors will give you like the exam material, and I know my students do this, right? So they look at the exam material and they're going through and they're like, yes, occipital lobe, yep, frontal lobe. I know this, all that's familiar. I guess I don't need to study. But the trouble is that just because we recognize it on the exam material doesn't mean that we're going to be able to recall it on the exam, if that makes sense, essentially. So you don't want to fall into that trap. Just because something looks familiar doesn't mean that you know it, because our recognition is good like that, essentially. Um, so let's talk about the memory process. Oh, one more thing. Relearning. You guys probably have experienced this, but it's the idea that if we learn something again, like the second time around, we're going to learn it a lot quicker. So if you learned a fact maybe about the brain in your psychology class, and then you took bio, and then you learn the same fact again, it's going to stick a lot easier the second time because it's not new. You already have a placeholder for it in your brain. Okay, so looking at memory, there are three steps in the memory process. So encoding, storing, and retrieving. And we're going to talk about them one at a time. But encoding is how information gets into your head in the first place. Storing means that it's going to stay in your head. And retrieving is when you pull information out of your brain, essentially. So the encoding step, what happens is first information has to come to our short-term memory. So you can think of short-term memory as anything that's on your mind right now. Literally whatever's floating through your head, whatever you're thinking about right now, that's your short-term memory. In 5 minutes, it's going to be something different, right? So first information has to enter our short-term memory. But here's the trick. Just because it's in our short-term memory doesn't mean it's going to get encoded. So the second point says info and STM only gets encoded if we rehearse it, if we do something with that information. So if you think about it, when you're in class taking notes, right, what's on your short-term memory is whatever the teacher is saying. And then in a couple PowerPoint slides, that is gone. The stuff you were just written down, it was gone. And now something else, something new was in your short-term memory, essentially. If it didn't work, where everything in our short-term memory got encoded, then we would all ace all of our exams and we would never forget anything. And that's why we have to study, right? Because we have to do something with the information in order to recall it. So let's talk a little bit more about this short-term memory. So it's just think of it, whatever's on our conscious awareness right now. And it's called short because it only lasts for a short amount of time. So whatever you're thinking about a couple minutes later, it's gone. It'll be replaced by something else. So for example, remembering a phone number to call somebody back. I grew up without cell phones, right? So if you wanted to call the pizza man, you would have to look up the phone number in the book and you would have to say it 915-214-9679, and you would have to repeat it to yourself so that you didn't forget it, essentially. Um, and also with short term memory is there's a limit to how much information you can hold in your head at once. With long-term memory, there's no such thing as like your brain being too full. So you can have lots and lots of information in your head. But with short-term memory, there is a limit. There is a cap on how much information you can hold in your mind at once. And that cap is roughly 7 items, give or take 2. So the average person, 5 to 9 numbers, 5 to 9 names in their head at once. There are things that you can do to improve your memory, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the average person, roughly 5 to 9 items. And this, I'm aging myself here. Okay, but back in the day, it used to be that like if you wanted to call somebody, you would just dial their 7-digit phone number. You didn't have to add in the area code. And I remember I was in college when they changed it, and my professors were like old grumpy men, and they're like, Miller's magic number 7. You add in the area code, no one's going to remember the phone numbers, and they were mad. They were mad about it. But of course, it doesn't really affect it because now we don't even memorize phone numbers anymore, right? But so there's a difference between your short-term memory and your working memory. So short-term memory, just whatever is in your head right now, flows in, flows out. Your working memory is like short-term memory on steroids, right? It becomes part of working memory if you're doing something with the information. So like if you are studying the information, if you're repeating it over and over, if you're doing something, if you're critically thinking about that information, that then it becomes working memory. So for example, this is why like students when they ask questions in class, because it means they're thinking about it, right? Instead of just writing it down and stuff like that. So for example, some of you might have been like, okay, this is a workshop on memory. I bet you she's going to ask me about that phone number. And you sat there and you repeated it over to yourself while I was talking. If that was you, go ahead and put that phone number in the chat. Let's see if you still remember it. Water. So if you can remember that phone number, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I'm going to wait a little bit because as soon as I X out of the presentation, it's going to show the phone number. I don't want to do that too early. So if you sat there and you repeated that phone number over and over to yourself, you activated your working memory. You did something with the information, and that's how it gets encoded. But if you just looked at the number and then you just, when it went away, you didn't think about it ever again, that number is gone. It's gone forever, and you're probably not going to be able to pull it back up. So let's see what we got here. Okay, yeah, 915. I don't know what it is. Let me look. 214-9769. Close, close. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's cute. Yeah, but that's how it works, though, essentially, right? So if you were like doing something with information, it's going to get encoded and you're more likely to remember it. But if it was like as soon as that went away, you never thought about it again, like most people, right, when they're taking notes in class, then it's just in your short-term memory and it doesn't get encoded. So remember the way that it works. Not everything in our short-term memory is going to get encoded. And it would probably be more accurate to say that most of the things in our short-term memory don't get encoded. They flow in and they flow out, and it's gone. It's gone forever unless you do something with information, which is why studying is important. So that's what we're going to talk about next are these effortful processing strategies. It's a big fancy name, but these are just techniques that make you more likely to recall information. And as we're going over these, I want you to think how you can use these as students, essentially. So there's, we'll go over six. There's definitely more than this, but we'll go over six ones that I think are most relevant for students. Um, and they're called effortful processing strategies because they take effort, right? Because we don't just retain everything that we think about, every note that we write down. No, you have to do something with the information. You have to activate your working memory to put in the effort in order to retain things. So, our first effortful processing strategy or technique is called chunking. And literally, they mean chunks like a chunk of pie or something like that. So chunking happens when we're grouping information. So you can think of a chunk as like a group. So specifically, if we're chunking, we're trying to break down information. We're trying to consolidate it. So remember, the max that we can hold in our head at once is 5 to 9 items. So if we consolidate information into chunks, then we can hold more chunks and hold more information. So when we say organizing information into manageable units, that's what we mean, is so that there's less of them. So for example, if you think of like your credit card, the reason why it's broken up like that is so that you can easily remember it. So instead of, what is that, 12, instead of however many numbers that there are right there, 16, 16 numbers is a lot to remember. We don't remember that. But 4 chunks, we can remember 4 chunks. Same thing with a social security number. The whole number itself is harder to remember, but if you remember 3 individual chunks, that makes it a little bit easier. So that's what we mean when we say manageable. It's consolidating the information. And when we say organizing information into familiar units, it means it has to mean something to us. We have to recognize it, essentially. So for example, we're going to do a little demonstration. So I'm going to put letters up on the screen. They're going to be up for like 4 seconds, and then they're going to go away. So make sure you pay attention. And then as soon as they disappear, I want you to write down all the letters that you can remember in the chat box. Okay, ready? So here come the letters. Again, try to remember as many as you can. Once they disappear, put them in the chat box. Okay, as many as you can remember, type them in the box. And so there were, I think there were 12 of them. Usually in that first time, we'll look at the results in a minute. Usually we don't get all 12. But it's hard. 12 is a lot. That's a lot to hold in our head. But what if we did something like this? Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. It's going to stay on the screen for 4 seconds. And now this time I want you to type in all the letters that you can remember. So ready? Here it comes. Okay, now how many letters can you remember? Let me look. It sounds like you guys are doing great. Let me look. Okay. Yes, FBI, USA, CNN, TMZ. Why? Why was that so much easier than the first time, where we didn't do as great? And that's okay. That's how memory works. Why was the second time around so much easier? Chunking, yeah, and they were recognizable as well too, right? So, uh, yes, like we know about the FBI. We live in the USA. TMZ. I don't know if it's still around, but it was like a trashy news site about celebrities. We know CNN is a news site, things like that. Yeah. So this had the best of both worlds with chunking. So the information was condensed into 4 chunks instead of 12 individual letters, and it was familiar. It meant something to us, essentially. So that's one technique. Another technique that we can do is called mnemonics, essentially. So before we get into mnemonics, I'm going to read you these words and we'll come back to them. So bicycle, inherent, void, fire, cigarette, and process. Don't write them down, just keep them. All right, so a mnemonic, the M is silent. A mnemonic is just a fancy word for memory trick, right? And you know these, even if you didn't know that you did. So for example, PEMDAS, like please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, that is a mnemonic. Or there was a song to remember the order of the planets. I don't remember it anymore, but that was a little mnemonic or a little memory trick. Any little trick that you come up with to help you remember something would be a mnemonic. And these actually came from ancient Greek philosophers. So today, your teachers in the classroom, like we have these beautiful PowerPoint slides with pictures that prompt us with what we want to say. But ancient Greek philosophers did not, right? We didn't have that kind of technology. So they used mnemonics, little memory tricks to help them remember their talking points, essentially. But for example, uh, one thing that's cool about mnemonics is if you can make a picture in your head, if you can imagine the thing in your head instead of just making the trick, you learn it better. You're more likely to remember it, essentially. So visual imagery is really strong for humans. But an example of a mnemonic, so we know that the average person can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items in their head. And that's called, for whatever reason in psychology, Miller's magic number 7. And so the way I tell my students to remember Miller's magic number 7 is think of that as like psychology's contribution to the sevens. Because we have the 7 C's, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 dwarfs, 7 wonders of the world. So you can think of Miller's magic number 7 as psychology's contribution to the sevens. Or, for example, the frontal lobe is the part of your brain that's responsible for like impulse control and critical thinking. And you can think that whenever someone does something dumb, you're like, and you face palm, right? And you touch your frontal lobe. So you can remember the frontal lobe is responsible for thinking, essentially. And there's actually memory world championships where people can do things like memorize the order of an entire deck of cards. And there's demonstrations where you're in a room with like 200 people that you're meeting for the first time and you memorize their first and their last names. And at first, when you look at these people, you think they must be like superhuman or something like that. But they're not. What they're doing is they're using mnemonics, they're using memory tricks. So, as a sidebar, photographic memory, it's called eidetic memory. Eidetic memory is actually a real thing, but not how it's portrayed to be in the movies. Usually, people who have eidetic memory suffer. Their quality of life suffers because they can't tune anything out. They can't forget anything. There is one guy who his name he's just called S in the literature. But for example, you could read him like a novel, and he would be able to memorize the novel, and he could recite it back to you. But if you asked him like, can you summarize that in 2 sentences, he couldn't do it. He couldn't synthesize the information essentially. So gains and losses with all of that. Okay, thinking of those words, those 6 words I showed you at the beginning, try to recall as many as you can. Type them into the chat. We had some words in this green box. So there's 6. Try to think as many as you can. Okay. So let's see what we got. You know what? I'm going to close that email. Okay. Process void, fire, inherent void. Yeah. Good. Wow. Claire did good. Yeah, awesome guys. Okay. Yeah. Usually what we see, like how Mia did, like the bicycle cigarette fire, that usually tends to be the pattern that we see. So it's a really, that's interesting. But when I do this in the classroom, I put all six of the letters, or all six of the words on the board. I'm like, how many remembered this? And we actually count how many that you remembered for them. And the reason why is because we differentiate between bicycle, fire, and cigarette, and then inherent, void, and process. So why would we put those into different categories? Like, why is bicycle, fire, and cigarette different from inherent, void, and process? What do you all think? And usually, bicycle, fire, and cigarette tend to be easier for us to remember than inherent, void, and process. And why do you think that is? Patricia, you're right. You're right on track. The physical concepts. Yeah, because if they're physical things, what can we do with them in our head? Yes, you can picture it. You can visualize it in your head. Exactly. Yeah. And remember what we said about mnemonics, right? They work better if you can create a mental picture, essentially. So it's kind of cool. So ideally, like you can even link them together, right? Picturing somebody riding a bicycle down the street, smoking a cigarette, and throwing it on the ground and starting a fire, which is awful, but it's something like that. Or, but like when I think of the word inherent, I don't have a mental picture that comes to mind with the word inherent. Void, I guess you can think of like space and process. You can think of arrows, but they're not as easy to picture as something that's a physical, tangible thing that you can touch, right? Essentially. So mnemonics are these are great memory tricks, especially if you have a lot of terms that you have to memorize. So if you are in an anatomy class or just any class where you have a lot of vocabulary words to memorize, mnemonics, right? Just come up with little memory tricks to help you remember the words essentially. Does anybody already do something like this? I'm just curious. Without even knowing what they were, you kind of already make up little memory tricks. And if you don't, make sure you start, right? Because that's a you can have all the tools in your toolbox, but if you don't use them, it's not going to help you. Oh, I do this all the time when I was a student, even today, to help me remember things. I have to come up with little memory tricks, what to buy at the grocery store. Okay, so the very best two techniques we're going to talk about six. The two best ones we're going to talk about right now. So the first one is called the spacing effect. And what this is that if you like space out or spread out your studying over time, then you actually retain the information. So spacing effect is if you space out your studying, study a little bit each day, then you actually retain the information. So real talk, they'll tell your professors I tell you this, but um, for example, like if you cram for an exam, you're probably going to get an A, right? And that's just because it's still in your short term memory. You haven't given yourself a chance to forget it yet. But if you cram for an exam, are you going to remember that information next week or next month or next semester? Thinking about how our memory works. Yeah. What I usually tell my students is if you cram, you'll get an A. Yeah. But your employers don't care if you have a 4.0 GPA. I know GPA sounds so important when we're young, and I used to be like, oh, a B, and I would cry. I don't even remember what my GPA was now, and it's so non-significant. I'm not even gonna look it up, right? I don't even know how I would look it up, right? Um, They don't care that you have a 4.0 GPA. What they care is that you've retained the knowledge to do the job, right? They're going to want somebody who knows what they're doing more than someone who had a perfect 4.0 GPA, right? And I'm not saying don't get A's. That's not what I'm saying. But just um, if you follow the spacing effect, if you study a little bit each day, then you actually remember the information. It sticks. It sticks in your brain, right? And then next semester you can be like, oh yeah, I did learn that in my one class, essentially. So that is, and this is, I don't like to use the word proven science, but this is proven. And we've known this for hundreds of years, right? You spread out your studying over time, the information sticks, essentially. The other good technique is something called the testing effect. So, and this one's cool. So this one says that if we test ourselves, we remember the information better. But really, you could, when we say, what I would write, if you're taking notes, what I wrote down is we test ourselves by practicing pulling the information out of our head. So if you practice pulling information out of your head, test yourself that way, that's when it increases your memory. So for example, it says we have enhanced better memory after practicing retrieving information instead of just rereading it. So if you're studying for an exam, and if you're looking at the exam material and you're like, I know all of this, I guess I don't need to study. What you should actually do is start with a blank piece of paper and then just write down everything that you know. And then compare it to your notes, and then you'll see where the deficit is. And even doing that is helping your study because you're practicing pulling information out of your brain. Something that's really cool about this is talking to a friend or family member or animal about whatever you're learning in your class. That also helps you study. And the reason why is because you're practicing pulling that information out of your head, right? So if you go after class and you tell somebody, guess what I learned about in psychology, encoding information and chunking and stuff like that, and you talk about what you learned, you're practicing retrieval. You're practicing pulling that information out. So it's going to be easier for you to retrieve that information on the exam, essentially. So what kind of study technique do you think would be good? There's one that students kind of commonly use that uses the testing effect. So instead of just rereading our notes or highlighting, what can we do when we're studying to try to practice retrieving information? Here are some techniques. And there's one that's old school, but it's still around because it works. Let's see what you guys said. Flashcards. Reciting it works too. Yeah, so repetition, you're activating your working memory. Flashcards. Flashcards is a big thing because you're practicing retrieving it, right? You're testing yourself essentially. Yeah. So just to reiterate, rereading your notes, I'm not saying don't do it, but it's not the best way to study. If you really want to learn something, you practice pulling that information out of your head. And the same thing, highlighting, you don't have to ditch it forever. I mean, I have highlighters. But just because you highlight something doesn't mean that you're going to memorize it, right? So if we want to be able to remember information, we have to study a little bit each day, spread out our encoding. And remember that cramming, so studying the night before, just rereading our notes and just highlighting, these aren't great ways, right? You want to spread out your studying and you want to practice pulling information out of your head. So there is a quote by, I think he was actually a physiologist, Herman Ebbinghaus, but he studied forgetfulness. And he said, those who learn quickly also forget quickly. And it's true. It's true. It's like weight. The quicker you lose it, the quicker you get it back. The same thing with memory. The quicker you learn it, the quicker you forget it. If you take that's okay. I know what I can compare it to. If you've ever binge watched a Netflix show, you know how if you watch a Netflix show like 8 episodes in like one day, and then like next month you can't remember anything about the show. That's why, because you watch it so quick. But if you were to take your time and go through it, then you would actually remember it. And same thing when we learn information in our classes as well too. So those are the important ones. I think they're all important, but those are the best ones for students to know. Okay, our fifth effortful processing strategy is using hierarchies. And this is something that you can do when you're taking notes. And some of you might already do this. So for example, if you're taking notes in like, I don't even know if you can see this, but you put your heading at the top and you underline it, and then you'll put like A, B, and C, and then you'll indent and put like bullet points and things like that. If you already kind of organize your notes like that, you're already using a hierarchy. And this is a good way to take notes. And the reason why is because if you put something as a bullet point underneath a category, you know that that bullet point goes with that category, like it's related. But if you start your note page where everything starts at the same, then you don't know what goes under what, right? There's no organization. So, and of course you could probably draw like this is like a little graph right here, but if you use bullet points or like numbers like 1, 2, and 3, A, B, and C, it helps you organize your notes a little bit better. Because it makes sense when we're in class when we're writing it down, right? But later on, when you go back and read it, you're like, I don't know what this means, right? So to organize your notes a little bit, and it's so quick, just to make a little bullet point or an indent. That's all you have to do. But a hierarchy is anything where you organize something from like broad to narrow. So for example, cognitive psychology is what we're talking about right now, and memory is just one subtopic of cognitive psychology. And coding is the first step in the memory process, and then we talked about all these different processing strategies underneath encoding kind of thing. And finally, levels of processing. So there's different ways that we can intake information. So for example, if you process information on a shallow level, it means you're not really thinking about it. So that would be like asking you to look at a word and say, what color is it? Or looking at a cup and saying, what color is it? You can answer those questions about like color or shape or size, whether it's big or small, without even reading the word, right? It's like quick. You can just look at something and be like, this is in capital letters, this is in lowercase. That's red, that's blue. You don't even have to really pay attention to answer those questions. So if you encode something on a shallow level, you're just very basic, elementary, you're not really paying attention. Versus if you code something on a deep level, that's different, right? So if you encode something on a deep level, you're thinking about the meaning behind it, essentially. So the word semantics means meaning. And another sidebar, have you ever done this where you've repeated a word like over and over and then it started to lose its meaning? Like one day you just said like pencil like 6 times and you're like, what is a pencil? And it lost its meaning to you. You know what I'm talking about? Hopefully. You guys are like, no, you're a crazy person. Okay. But well, that happens sometimes, right? If you say a word like over and over, sometimes like it sounds funny. It doesn't sound like a real word anymore. And then it actually has a name. It's called semantic satiation. So it's like you're satiated of the meaning. You're too full of the meaning, essentially. So to encode something on a deep level, you think about the meaning of the word, or breaking words down into like root words and prefixes and suffixes. That's another great way to do it as well too, because you're thinking about the structure, the meaning of the word. So encoding information on the deep level helps you remember it. Shallow level, no. So this is just, let's pretend that we were participants in a psychology experiment and this was our task, right? We had to look at words on the screen, and they would ask us, is the word in capital letters? You don't even have to read the word to say yes, no, to decide whether it's capital letters or not, right? But guess what? If you do this test And then later on, you come back and the experimenters give you a recognition test, and they say, "Did you see the word chair? Did you see the word brain? Did you see the word doll?" You're gonna say, "No, no, I don't remember that. I don't remember brain. I don't remember doll." Even though humans have excellent recognition memory, right? Because you weren't paying attention. You were just looking at what it looked like. It was at elementary level. So no, our recognition memory is so good, you're not going to recognize those words if you were just encoding it on a shallow level. But if you're encoding something on a deep level, so for example, like for each word that you see on the screen, will it fit in this sentence? The girl put the blank on the table. Okay, so the girl put the chair on the table. Yeah, that fits. You're cleaning up the bar or the restaurant and you turn the chairs upside down, put them on the table. The girl put the brain on the table. Probably not. The girl put the doll on the table. Yeah, that makes sense. You can lay a baby doll on the table. If you did this whole task like that, where you process information on a deep level, and then they ask you again, like, do you remember seeing the word chair? You're going to say yes. Do you remember saying the word brain? Yes. Do you remember saying the word doll? Yes, essentially. So if you think about the meaning of the word instead of something superficial, like what it looks like, what it sounds like, then you retain the information a little bit better, essentially. So cool stuff that you can use to help you while you're studying. Hopefully you came away with a couple of things. Um, we'll keep going. I think I have like 10 minutes, so I'll keep going. And hopefully it's interesting. Hopefully I'm not boring you guys. But so we know the first step in the memory process is encoding, which is how information gets into your head in the first place. Storing is the next step. And this is just when information goes from short-term memory to our conscious awareness to our long-term memory. And once it enters our long-term memory, that means that we're good, right? That later on we can retrieve it. One saying that we have in psychology is that the brain is not like a library. So if you think of like a library, like each book has its specific place that it goes. And if you're like me, you have no idea how that system works, right? And the librarians always have the signs that say, like, don't reshelf the books yourself because no one else understands their system, right? The brain is not like a library. What that means is there's not just one specific place in our head where our memories are stored, right? So it's not like you can cut this little tiny part of your brain and specifically cut out the memory of your 21st birthday, or cut one little part of the brain and cut out the memory of the color blue or something. It doesn't work like that. So there's not just one specific place where memories are stored. They're all throughout the brain. So this picture I found on the internet is not accurate, essentially. I'm going to stop and look at the chat really quick. Let's see. Do you like it? All right. Okay, cool. All right. So there is a part of the brain called the hippocampus, and this is the save button of the brain. So the hippocampus is what allows us to download new information into our head. So, or make new memories. If you think of like, it's an old movie now, but 50 First Dates with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore. With Drew Barrymore, like she would go to sleep at night and then she would wake up, but she wouldn't remember anything from the day before. She just was like living the same day over and over. There was something wrong with her hippocampus. And that's a real thing. It's not as clean cut as every time you go to sleep, your brain resets. But absolutely, you can damage your hippocampus with a stroke or some other tumor or anything, and then not be able to download new information into your brain. Right. So it's kind of cool. But so again, sidebar, sorry. Okay. But when we're sleeping, what happens is something called memory consolidation, essentially. And this is the term for when information goes from short-term memory storage to your long-term memory storage. And that happens at night when you're sleeping, right? So I remember when I was growing up, my parents would always be like, quit studying, go to bed, get a good night's sleep before the exam. And I'm just like, I'm not doing that, right? But they're right. Like so many things that they're right? So when you sleep, that's when information goes from your short-term memory to your long-term memory storage. Once it's in long-term memory, then it's going to stick right? And you can later on retrieve it essentially. So it is super important to sleep. And in fact, um, because college students notoriously don't get enough sleep because of your lifestyle, that's you're studying, you're busy. You have probably noticed that when you don't sleep as much, your memory doesn't work as good, right? And that's the reason why. It's because consolidation happens when you're sleeping, essentially. Okay, and then the final step in the memory process is retrieval. So encoding is how it gets into your head in the first place, storing is when it moves to long-term memory, and retrieving is pulling it out, pulling information out of your head, essentially. And even with the retrieval step, there are some things that you can do to help you remember things better. So I think this is probably the last slide we're going to have time for. I think we only go into 150, but we'll see. But there's something called context-dependent memories and state-dependent memories, and I want to talk about these really quick. So context here, this refers to like the situation or the environment. So context-dependent memories are memories that are dependent on your situation or your environment. Um, And so what this means is, I'll tell you the study. It was ridiculous. I don't know who approved this, but there is a study where they were looking at scuba divers and they were having them learn word pairs. And so they either learned the word pairs in the water or they learned the word pairs on the land. And then they took a test. Don't ask me how the heck they did this in the water, but they either took a test in the water or on the land. And so here's the results. Here they found if you learned your words in the water and you tested on the water, you did good. If you learned your words in the land and you tested on the land, you did good. But if there was a crisscross, if you learned in the land, tested in the water, or vice versa, no, you didn't do as good. So what that means is that the context, the environment, the situation can serve as a retrieval cue. It can help us remember information better. So the ways that you can use this as a student would be, for example, to make your study environment as much like your testing environment as possible. So if you think about your testing environment, your classroom, it's kind of probably cold, quiet, white walls, not a lot of distractions. If you're studying like on your bed, listening to music and eating and things like that, it's so you want to make your study environment as similar as possible to your testing environment. Kind of a stretch, but also like if you choose strawberry bubblegum when you're studying, choose strawberry bubblegum when you take the exam. Same thing. If you eat peanut butter when you're studying, eat peanut butter when you take the exam. And I think this is where the myth that peppermint makes you smarter comes from, because it doesn't. There's nothing that says that peppermint increases your memory. But unless you sucked on a peppermint when you were studying, then you want to suck on the peppermint when you took your exam. And it's funny because we don't think that the context could be that powerful, but it is, right? So if you ever experience something out of context, you know how powerful the context is. So for example, my poor students, every once in a while, like I'll see them out in the wild, right? And I'll be like, "Hi," and they're like, and they know me, but they don't know from where, right? And then this one time it was the best. There was like one of the students was like with his little girlfriend, and I was like, "Sam, you have to turn in your homework," and he was like, and his face was like horrified because another girl talked to him in front of his girlfriend. Then he remembered I was his teacher, and he was like, "Oh my god," because I look like I'm 16. Or if you've ever saw like your doctor or your dentist like in Walmart or something like that, you're like, I know them, but you can't place where you know them from. It's because if you see someone outside of the context you normally see them in, it's confusing essentially, right? You're not used to seeing it. Let me pause really quick and see how much time we have. Did we go to just to 150? You can keep going. Okay. Is there a time I should stop? I don't know how these work. I should know. No? Okay, we'll keep going. All right. So So that's context dependent memories, essentially. But, and again, so you can use that to your advantage as a student, right? Make your study environment as similar as possible to your testing environment. Another one is state dependent memories. This one, well, yeah, I guess it could still be relevant to you guys. But state refers to like your mental state or your emotional state. So in this case, your ability to remember something depends on your state of mind, essentially. So don't don't take this the wrong way, okay? But what we learn in one state of mind might be more easily recalled when we're in that state of mind again, essentially. So don't get me wrong, alcohol always is going to decrease your memory, right? That's what it does. It does not make your memory better. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I can tell you that there were times when I was younger and I was living at home with my parents, and I would go out and I would come home and I would hide my money in my room because I didn't want my little brother to find it. And then the next day I would have no idea where it was. But then the next time I went out and drank, I would be like, "Oh, that's where I hid my money," and suddenly it would come to me, kind of thing. That would be an example of a state-dependent memory. Generally speaking, any mind-altering substance is going to make your memory worse. Um, so I don't want you to be sitting there thinking like, I'm going to study drunk and take the exam drunk. No, right? Or don't study high and take the exam high. No, study sober, take the exam sober, right? That's what we learn from this. And it also comes with your emotional states as well too, right? Um, this one's a little bit harder to control because, if you study when you're in a bad mood, it's not like you want to recreate the bad mood when you take your exam. So the context dependent really serves students better. But for example, think about like if you are mad at your significant other, um, you're more likely to think of other times that they made you mad instead of all the good things about them. You know what I mean? Right? So being mad helps you remember other times you were mad at them. Or same thing, like if you're happy, if you're having a great day, you're going to think of happy thoughts, not bad thoughts. You know what I mean? So your emotions can even serve as a retrieval cue as well too, which is pretty cool. But study sober, take the test sober. Just a couple other things. So there is something in psychology called the serial position effect, and this has to do with the order in which we receive information. So basically, the stuff we learn last, we're better at remembering. And it's called the recency effect. And the reason why that happens is because it's still in our short-term memory. We haven't had a chance to forget it yet. It's fresh. It's fresh in our mind, right? So if you are learning like chapters 1 through 4 and you have an exam over those, chapter 4 you're going to know really well because you just covered it. It's fresh. But also, the opposite happens. The first items we see tend to be recalled better. That's called the primacy effect. So that means not only chapter 4 are you going to know really well, but chapter 1 as well too. Right? So 1 and 4 you're going to be great at. Chapter 1, it's because you've had longer to practice it. You've had longer to study it, essentially. Stuff in the middle, we tend to forget. You can even think about it like if you are at a party, right? Let's say you're at a party and you go and you meet 5 new people and learn their names. The first person you meet, you're going to repeat their name like, okay, Alex, 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 right? Then you meet the second person, the third person, the fourth person, their names are gone. Then the last person, John, and then you repeat their name, So you remember Alex's name because you had the most time to rehearse that. You repeated it over and over and over. People in the middle, their names are gone. And then the very last name, essentially, it's still fresh in your mind, so you still remember that. So it's something to keep in mind when you're studying. Pay special attention to the information you learned in the middle. Not the first stuff, not the last stuff, but the stuff in the middle, because that's the stuff that we're more likely to forget, essentially. Yeah, we'll do this last one, and then I'll let you guys go because I'm sure you have class at 2. Right? But the way that memory works is that items in our memory are interconnected. So what that means is like if we think of a strawberry, we just don't have like a strawberry isolated in our head. But if we think of a strawberry, it makes us think of other things like blueberries and summer and shortcake and strawberry blonde hair. And then maybe you have strawberry perfume, so you think of perfume and things like that.
Carrie, there's a question in the chat. Do you
Yeah,
have any
yeah, sorry.
do you have any tricks to remember the middle stuff? Is what they're asking.
Yeah, those everflow processing strategies. Coming up with the mnemonics and making sure that you activate your working memory essentially. Um, so just as long as you do something with that information, you'll be more likely to remember it. So just the stuff that we talked about. So trying to make sure that you process it on a deep level by thinking about what it means, coming up with a little memory tricks, consolidating that information, anything like that. Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, for sure. I guess I could stop. Any other questions that you all have? Math formulas. Oh, that's a good question. Those are hard. See, even though I'm psychology, I teach statistics, like psychological statistics, and I don't have my students memorize formulas um, because it's hard, right? I would rather them know what to apply the formula for than memorize it. But if you do have to memorize formulas, um, yeah, honestly, yeah. Um, there's some cases where just like rote memorization would be best, and just this might be one of those things where you get so used to working the formula if you like, and not even just like writing down the formula itself, but working through the formula, right? So like plugging that formula in, if you do lots of practice calculating the mean or whatever it is, um, eventually it's going to almost be like muscle memory essentially, right? Like kind of how like when you unlock your phone, you just draw the pattern and you don't think about it. Or if you're driving in the car, you don't really know whether the gas pedal is on the left side or the right side, but your foot kind of just does it because it's muscle memory. I wonder that if you did so many practice problems that it would become like muscle memory for your hand, almost kind of thing, and make it a little bit easier. Any other questions? Well, hopefully you guys all think that memory is cool now after after having this. So I think I'll stop. I'm going to stop talking at you. But thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Carrie. You have done a wonderful job today. I could tell the whole audience was responding and having a good time with you. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation today. I'd like to thank the audience for coming in on this Friday bash and joining us. And then before I let everyone go, I'm going to just invite you guys real quick to next week. Feel free to raise your hand if you do have a question for Miss Van Hoot. Okay. So today's session was memory tricks, but next week, February 14th, for our Valentine's TVEs for Math 1314 and Math 1324 at 11 a.m. for Happy Math Hour, we'll be covering over Exam 1 reviews. So if you have a test coming up for those courses, I recommend you join us. And if you'd just like to review anyway, we'd be happy to have you. For the 1 p.m. session, we're going to have a presentation from the EPCC libraries and what they can do to help you. So if you're new to school, you want to check out the EPCC libraries. They have a lot of services that would surprise you. So join us next week at 1 p.m. I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and join us next week for our session. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.